She stood there, 6 feet tall, her dark skin gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights of the Milan casting studio. The designer took one look at her portfolio, then at her face, and laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a full, mocking laugh that echoed through the room. He tossed her portfolio onto the table, without even opening it completely, and said the words that would change everything. "We don't do charity work here. This isn't a diversity quota show. Your skin is too dark for high fashion. Go try urban streetwear or something more suitable for your look." The other assistants in the room shifted uncomfortably, but nobody said a word. She picked up her portfolio with trembling hands, her jaw clenched tight, and walked out. But what that designer didn't know was that someone else was watching, someone with the power to turn his cruelty into her greatest triumph. 7 days later, that same designer would be standing in Times Square, staring up at a billboard 50 feet high, and the face looking back at him would be hers. Before we continue with what happened next, let us know where you're watching this from. Are you in New York City, London, Los Angeles, Chicago, Toronto, or somewhere else entirely? Drop your city in the comments, because this story spread across every major fashion capital in the world, and someone from your city might have witnessed what happened next. This isn't just a story about revenge. This is about justice, power, and how one moment of cruelty became a global movement that would reshape the fashion industry forever. Her name was Aisha Thompson, and she had been modeling for 3 years. She had done commercial work, catalog shoots, and a few editorials for smaller magazines, but breaking into high fashion had been impossible. Every agency told her the same thing: she was beautiful, yes, but the industry wasn't ready for someone with her skin tone in luxury campaigns. They said it with apologetic smiles, as if it were a fact of nature rather than a choice. Aisha had heard it so many times that she almost believed it herself. But she kept showing up to castings, kept submitting her portfolio, kept hoping that eventually someone would see past the color of her skin and recognize her talent. She had grown up in Detroit, the youngest of 4 children, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep them fed and clothed. When Aisha told her family she wanted to be a model, they were skeptical. Modeling seemed like a pipe dream, something for other people, people with connections and money and the right look. But Aisha's mother had seen something in her daughter's eyes, a determination that wouldn't be extinguished, and she'd told her to go for it. So Aisha had saved every penny from her retail job, moved to New York at 20, one with 2 suitcases and a dream, and started knocking on doors. The first year had been brutal. She lived in a tiny apartment in Queens with 3 other aspiring models, all of them chasing the same impossible dream. They shared makeup, borrowed each other's clothes, practiced their walks in the cramped hallway. Aisha went to open calls, submitted her photos to agencies, did test shoots for photographers trying to build their portfolios. Some days she booked small jobs that paid just enough to cover her rent. Other days she came home with nothing but rejection and the creeping doubt that maybe everyone had been right, maybe this wasn't meant for her. But she kept going. She improved her walk, studied fashion magazines obsessively, learned how to pose, how to move, how to convey emotion with just a glance. By her second year, she'd signed with a mid-tier agency that got her steady commercial work. She appeared in department store catalogs, online advertisements for affordable clothing brands, even a few television commercials. It was decent money enough to live on, but it wasn't what she dreamed about. She dreamed about high fashion, about walking runways in Paris and Milan, about seeing her face in Vogue. The casting that day was for Lorenzo Vitelli's spring collection. Vitelli was one of the biggest names in European fashion, known for his elegant designs and his exclusive clientele. Getting booked for his show would have been a career-defining moment, the kind of breakthrough that could launch a model from commercial work into the stratosphere of high fashion. Aisha arrived 2 hours early, her portfolio perfectly organized, her walk practiced until it was flawless. She had spent the previous night going over every detail, making sure her book showcased her best work, her most versatile looks. She waited with 30 other models, most of them tall, thin, and pale, watching as one after another was called into the room. Some came out smiling, others looked disappointed. When her name was called, she walked into the room with her head high, determined to prove she belonged there. Lorenzo Vitelli was sitting behind a large white desk, flanked by his creative director and 2 assistants. He was in his 50s, silver-haired, wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than Aisha's rent for 6 months. He had the kind of face that looked permanently bored, as if nothing in the world could possibly surprise or interest him anymore. The walls of the room were covered with sketches from his upcoming collection, elegant evening gowns and tailored suits in neutral tones. Everything about the space screamed exclusivity, refinement, luxury. Aisha handed him her portfolio and introduced herself, her voice steady despite the nervousness twisting in her stomach. She'd rehearsed this moment 100 times, knew exactly what she wanted to say, how she wanted to present herself. He glanced at the first page, then the second. His expression remained neutral, but there was something in his eyes that made Aisha's confidence waver. Then he looked up at her, and that's when he laughed. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't kind. It was the kind of laugh that made everyone in the room freeze. The kind that said he found something genuinely amusing in a cruel sort of way. His creative director looked down at her clipboard, suddenly fascinated by whatever was written there. The assistants suddenly found something fascinating about their shoes, and Aisha felt her entire body go cold, a creeping sensation starting in her chest and spreading outward. What exactly am I looking at here? Vitelli said, still chuckling as he flipped through a few more pages of her portfolio without really seeing them. Did your agency send you as a joke? Because if this is their idea of a prank, it's not particularly funny. Aisha's throat tightened, but she forced herself to speak, to maintain whatever dignity she could in this moment. I'm a professional model, Mr. Vitelli. I have 3 years of experience and... Experience doing what? He interrupted, his tone dripping with condescension. Community fashion shows, local festivals, church charity events. He slid her portfolio back across the desk without looking at it again, the gesture dismissive and final. Let me explain something to you, sweetheart, because clearly nobody else has had the honesty to tell you the truth. High fashion is about aspiration. It's about beauty that people want to reach for, not beauty that reminds them of their housekeeper, or their nanny, or the woman who cleans their office building at night. Your skin is too dark for my vision. It doesn't photograph well under studio lights. It doesn't sell luxury. It doesn't make people dream. Do you understand what I'm saying? The room was silent except for the quiet hum of the air conditioning. Aisha felt tears burning behind her eyes, hot and insistent, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of him. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break down. I understand perfectly, she said quietly, her voice somehow still steady even though everything inside her was collapsing. Good, Vitelli said, waving his hand dismissively as if swatting away an annoying insect. Then we're done here. Close the door on your way out. Aisha picked up her portfolio, her hands trembling slightly, and turned to leave. But as she reached the door, her hand on the handle, she heard him say something to his creative director, loud enough for her to hear. It was intentional, she realized. He wanted her to hear it. These agencies need to stop wasting my time with these diversity hires, he said with an exaggerated sigh. I'm running a business, not a charity. If they want to feel good about themselves, they can donate to a cause. But don't send these people to my castings and expect me to pretend they belong here. The creative director murmured something in agreement, and Vitelli laughed again, that same cruel, mocking sound. Aisha walked out of that building feeling smaller than she ever had in her life. The Milan street was busy with afternoon traffic, tourists taking photos, locals rushing to their next appointment. The sun was bright and warm, completely at odds with the cold emptiness she felt inside. She sat on the steps outside, her portfolio clutched against her chest, and finally let herself cry. She had been rejected before, countless times, but never like this, never with such open cruelty, never with such casual dismissal of not just her talent, but her humanity. She pulled out her phone, thinking about calling her mother, her agent, anyone who might tell her it was going to be okay. Her thumb hovered over her mother's contact, but she couldn't bring herself to dial. What would she even say? That another designer had confirmed what everyone had been telling her all along. That maybe it was time to give up on this dream and find something more realistic. But before she could decide, someone sat down next to her on the steps. That was rough, the woman said gently, her voice carrying a warmth that felt like a lifeline in that moment. Aisha looked up, wiping her eyes hastily. The woman was in her 40s, dressed in an elegant black coat and designer sunglasses. She had perfectly styled hair and carried herself with an air of authority, the kind of person who was used to being in charge, who commanded respect simply by entering a room. You were in there? Aisha asked, confused and embarrassed that someone had witnessed her humiliation. I was waiting in the hall, the woman said. The door wasn't completely closed. I heard everything. Lorenzo Vitelli is a pig. He's been saying things like that for years, destroying careers and crushing dreams with his cruelty, but nobody calls him out because he's powerful, because the fashion industry protects its own, especially when they're making money. Who are you? Aisha asked, studying the woman's face. The woman smiled, and there was something fierce in that smile, something that suggested she was someone you wanted on your side. My name is Gabrielle Ross. I'm the Chief Creative Officer for Luminance Cosmetics. Have you heard of us? Aisha nodded slowly, her mind racing. Luminance was one of the biggest beauty brands in the world, competing with the likes of Dare and Chanel and Estee Lauder. Their campaigns were everywhere, on billboards in major cities, in glossy magazine spreads, on television during prime time. They were known for their innovative products and their massive advertising budgets. I was here to meet with Vitelli about a potential collaboration. Gabrielle continued, her expression hardening. A partnership that would have been worth millions to his brand. But after what I just heard, that meeting is canceled. I don't do business with bigots, no matter how talented they think they are. And I'd like to offer you something instead. Aisha stared at her, not quite believing what she was hearing. Her heart was pounding now, a different kind of nervousness replacing the despair. Offer me what? A campaign. Gabrielle said simply, as if she were offering a cup of coffee, rather than something that could change Aisha's entire life. Our global campaign for the new Luminance Noir collection. We're launching in 6 weeks, and we need a face. Not just any face. We need someone who represents what beauty actually looks like in the real world. Someone bold. Someone unforgettable. Someone who can look a camera in the eye and make people believe that they're looking at the future. She looked at Aisha directly, and Aisha felt the intensity of that gaze. Someone exactly like you. Aisha's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. You're serious. You don't even know my work. You haven't seen my full portfolio, you. I watched you walk into that building 2 hours ago. Gabrielle interrupted. I saw the way you carried yourself, the confidence, the grace. I saw you wait with all those other models, and I noticed how you stood out, even though you were trying to blend in. And then I saw you walk out of that room with your head still high after what that man said to you. After he tried to destroy you with his words. That's the kind of strength I want representing my brand. That's the kind of woman who can sell not just makeup, but an entire philosophy. She pulled a business card from her coat pocket and handed it to Aisha. Come to my office tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. sharp. We'll do a test shoot, and if it works the way I think it will, we'll move forward with the contract. This would be print, digital, billboards, television, social media, full global exposure. Your face would be in every major city in the world. Aisha took the card with shaking hands, staring at the embossed letters, the gold foil, the address of Luminance's headquarters in Manhattan. Why are you doing this? You don't even know me. Gabrielle's expression hardened, and Aisha saw something fierce and determined in her eyes. Because I'm tired of people like Lorenzo Vitelli deciding what beauty is allowed to look like. I'm tired of watching talented people get crushed because they don't fit some outdated, racist standard that was never about art or fashion, but about power and exclusion. And because talent like yours shouldn't be wasted sitting on steps crying after some arrogant designer makes you feel worthless. She stood up, adjusting her sunglasses. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., don't be late. And Aisha, she paused, looking down at her. What happened in that room today is going to be the best thing that ever happened to your career. Trust me. She walked away, her heels clicking confidently on the pavement, leaving Aisha sitting on those steps, holding a business card that felt like it might change her entire life. That night, Aisha barely slept. She lay in her hotel room, staring at the ceiling, replaying the entire day over and over. She kept hearing Vitelli's words, the way he'd laughed, the way he'd dismissed her like she was nothing, like she was less than nothing. But she also kept thinking about Gabrielle's offer. It felt too good to be true, like something that would be taken away the moment she reached for it. She'd learned to be skeptical of promises in this industry. She'd been told so many times that she was almost, right? That if she were just a little lighter, a little different, she'd be perfect. But Gabrielle hadn't said that. Gabrielle had said she was exactly what they needed. She arrived at the Luminance headquarters the next morning at 9:30, 30 minutes early because she couldn't stand waiting in her hotel room any longer. Her portfolio was in hand, and she'd chosen her best outfit carefully. Simple, elegant, something that showed she understood style without trying too hard. The Luminance building was stunning, all glass and steel and modern art hanging in the lobby. Everything about it screamed success and innovation. Gabrielle met her in the lobby personally, which surprised Aisha. Someone at Gabrielle's level usually sent assistants to handle things like this, someone lower on the corporate ladder to do the preliminary work. But Gabrielle walked her up to the top floor herself, talking the entire time about the vision for the campaign, her passion evident in every word. "We're calling it Luminance Noir," Gabrielle explained as they stepped into a massive photography studio that occupied what must have been half of the entire floor. It's a collection designed specifically for deeper skin tones. Foundations in 40 different shades, lipsticks that actually show up on dark skin, highlighters that create that glow without looking ashy. For too long, beauty brands have treated black women as an afterthought, creating a few token dark shades and calling it diversity. We're making them the priority. This is a full collection, developed by chemists who actually understand melanin, rich skin, tested on hundreds of women to make sure every product is perfect. And you're going to be the face of that message. You're going to show the world that beauty doesn't start and end with pale skin and European features. The test shoot lasted 4 hours. The photographer was a woman named Simone, patient and encouraging, taking her time to try different lighting setups, different angles, different expressions. Aisha felt herself relaxing as the shoot progressed, getting into the flow of the work. This was what she loved about modeling, the artistry of it, the collaboration, the way a single photograph could tell a story, convey an emotion, capture something intangible and make it real. Simone kept murmuring her approval, calling out encouragement, asking Aisha to try different things. She photographed her laughing, serious, contemplative, fierce. She captured the elegant line of Aisha's neck, the striking angles of her face, the way light played across her skin, creating shadows and highlights that were absolutely stunning. When they finally wrapped, Gabrielle pulled her aside into a private office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. "You're perfect," she said simply, pulling up the test images on a large monitor. "Absolutely perfect. Look at these, Aisha. You're a natural. The camera loves you. You have this quality that's rare. You can be strong and vulnerable at the same time, fierce and approachable. That's what we need." Aisha looked at the images, barely recognizing herself. She looked powerful. She looked like she belonged on magazine covers and billboards. She looked like everything high fashion had told her she could never be. "I want to offer you an exclusive contract," Gabrielle continued, pulling out a document that was already prepared. 6 months, with an option to extend for another 6 if things go well. The payment is $300,000 for the first 6 months, plus royalties on product sales tied to the campaign. If Luminance Noir does as well as I think it will, those royalties could be substantial. Aisha felt the room spin. $300,000. That was more money than she'd made in her entire modeling career combined. That was more money than her mother had made in the last 5 years. That was life-changing money, the kind that could pay off debt, secure her future, give her options she'd never had before. "There's one more thing," Gabrielle said, and there was something in her smile now, something that suggested she'd been saving the best part for last. Her eyes were gleaming with an emotion that Aisha couldn't quite identify. Anticipation, maybe, or satisfaction. "The campaign launches in exactly 1 week. We've been working on this for months, and everything's ready except for the face. We move fast at Luminance when we know what we want, and I've purchased Billboard space in every major fashion capital in the world. New York, London, Paris, Milan, Los Angeles, Tokyo, Sao Paulo, Dubai. Your face is going to be everywhere. Including," she paused, and her smile widened, "a 50-foot billboard in Times Square, directly across from the building where Lorenzo Vitelli has his New York office. He'll see your face every single day when he comes to work, and he'll know exactly how wrong he was." Aisha felt something fierce and hot rising in her chest. It wasn't quite revenge, though there was an element of that. It was vindication. It was justice. It was proof that Vitelli had been catastrophically wrong, that his narrow definition of beauty had no power over her future. "When do we start?" she asked, her voice steady and sure. "Right now," Gabrielle said, sliding the contract across the desk. "Sign this, and let's change the fashion industry together." The next 6 days were an absolute whirlwind. Aisha signed the contract that afternoon, her hand barely shaking as she put her signature on the page. She did photo shoots for print ads, working with some of the best photographers in the industry. She filmed television commercials, learning how to deliver lines naturally while maintaining that model poise. She recorded radio spots, her voice describing the products and the philosophy behind them. The creative team at Luminance worked around the clock to prepare the campaign launch, operating with a precision and efficiency that amazed Aisha. Everyone involved seemed to understand they were working on something special, something that could genuinely shift the conversation. Gabrielle was hands-on with every single detail, personally approving every image, every tagline, every placement. She had vision boards covering the walls of her office, mood boards with images of strong Black women throughout history, quotes about beauty and representation and power. The message of the campaign was clear and bold. Beauty has no limits, luminance nowhere, for every shade of beautiful. But it went deeper than that. The ads featured Aisha but also included copy about the development process, about how many women had been consulted, about the science behind creating products that actually worked for deeper skin tones. Aisha's face was in every single image, but she was captured in so many different ways. Close-ups that showed her flawless skin in stunning detail, the texture and richness of her complexion. Her full lips painted in rich burgundy, deep plum, coral that actually showed up vibrant and true. Her eyes lined with gold that made her dark irises shine with an almost supernatural intensity. The photographers captured her strength, her elegance, her vulnerability, her joy. Looking at the final images, even Aisha could barely believe it was her. She looked powerful. She looked expensive. She looked like exactly what high fashion had told her she could never be. Aspirational, luxurious, the kind of beauty that made people stop and stare. 3 days before the launch, Gabrielle called her into the office for a meeting. When Aisha arrived, she found Gabrielle standing in front of a massive screen that took up an entire wall, showing a digital mock-up of the Times Square Billboard installation. "I wanted you to see this before it goes live," Gabrielle said, her voice carrying a note of pride. The image on the screen was breathtaking. Aisha's face, 50 feet tall, would be glowing against the New York skyline. The photography was stunning, shot during golden hour, so the light seemed to emanate from her skin. The tagline beneath it read, "They said she wasn't beautiful enough. We said she's perfect. Luminance noir." Aisha felt tears spring to her eyes again, but this time they were completely different. These weren't tears of humiliation or pain or rejection. These were tears of triumph, of vindication, of finally being seen and celebrated for exactly who she was. "There's something else," Gabrielle said quietly, her tone shifting to something more serious. "I need you to see this before I move forward with it." She clicked to another slide. It showed an email draft, clearly written with care and legal precision, addressed to every major fashion publication and industry insider in the world. The subject line read, "Why Lorenzo Vitelli will never work with Luminance Cosmetics, and why that matters." Aisha read the email carefully, her heart pounding. It didn't mention her specifically by name, which she appreciated, but it detailed a pattern of discriminatory behavior from Vitelli spanning years, backed up by testimonies from former employees and models who had experienced similar treatment. Some of the stories made Aisha's stomach turn. Models told they were too dark, too ethnic, too exotic, not exotic enough. Assistants who had witnessed racist comments during castings and fittings. Pattern makers who had been instructed not to fit samples on anyone darker than a certain shade. The email was professional, factual, carefully worded to avoid any potential legal issues, and absolutely devastating. "I've been collecting these testimonies for the past week," Gabrielle said. "I reached out to people I know in the industry, asked them to share their experiences with Vitelli, or put me in touch with others who had stories." The response was overwhelming. Dozens of people came forward, some of them willing to go on record, others who needed anonymity, but whose stories were too consistent to ignore. "I've had lawyers review everything to make sure we're on solid legal ground. I'm sending this the same day the campaign launches. The timing is intentional. I want people to see your face on those billboards and then understand exactly why representation matters, why diversity can't just be performative, why we need to hold people accountable for their actions." She turned to look at Aisha directly. "You don't have to be involved if you don't want to be. I can keep your story anonymous. This is my decision, my responsibility. But I wanted you to know what I'm planning." Aisha was quiet for a long moment, staring at the email on the screen. Part of her wanted to shrink from this, to keep her head down, to not make waves. That was what she'd been taught, wasn't it? Be grateful for opportunities. Don't rock the boat. Don't make yourself a target. But another part of her, the part that had grown stronger over these past few days, knew that silence was complicity. How many other young models were being told right now that they weren't good enough? How many were being crushed by people like Vitelli who wielded their power like a weapon? "Send it," she said firmly. "Use my name. Tell my story. If we're going to do this, let's do it right. The campaign launched on a Wednesday morning at exactly 6 a.m. Eastern Time. The Luminance team had coordinated across time zones to ensure that billboards in every city went live simultaneously. Within an hour, Aisha's face was on billboards in 17 cities across 6 continents. The Times Square billboard lit up at precisely 6:15, massive and impossible to ignore, visible from blocks away. People stopped on the sidewalk to stare up at it, pulling out their phones to take pictures. The image was so striking, so powerful, that it commanded attention even in the visual chaos of Times Square. The social media response was immediate and explosive. People started posting photos of the billboards from their cities within minutes. Someone in London captured the Piccadilly Circus billboard at dawn. Someone in Tokyo got a video of the Shibuya crossing display. Paris, Milan, Los Angeles, images flooded in from everywhere, all tagged with Fan Luminance Noir. People praised the campaign's bold message, Aisha's stunning beauty. The fact that a major beauty brand was finally prioritizing women of color rather than treating them as an afterthought. The hashtag trended worldwide within 3 hours, shared by celebrities, influencers, ordinary people who felt seen and represented for perhaps the first time. At 8 a.m., Gabrielle sent the email about Lorenzo Vitelli to every major fashion industry contact she had accumulated over 2 decades in the business. She sent it to editors of Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, Elle, InStyle. She sent it to buyers at Bergdorf Goodman, Harrods, Galeries Lafayette. She sent it to other designers, to photographers, to casting directors. She sent it to industry organizations and fashion councils. By 9 a.m., the story was breaking on fashion news websites. Business of Fashion picked it up first, then Vogue, Com, then the mainstream press. By 10 a.m., it was trending on social media alongside the Luminance Noir campaign. The timing was perfect. People seeing the beautiful campaign images and immediately afterward learning about the systemic discrimination that had tried to prevent those images from existing. Former models began sharing their own stories about Vitelli's behavior, emboldened by Gabrielle's public stance. Women who had stayed silent for years, afraid of being blacklisted in an industry that protected its powerful figures, suddenly found their voices. They talked about humiliating castings, racist comments, being told they weren't high fashion enough. Industry insiders who had witnessed these behaviors, but looked the other way, began admitting they should have spoken up sooner. The dam had broken, and there was no stopping the flood. This wasn't just about one designer anymore. It was about an entire system that had enabled and protected discriminatory behavior for decades. Lorenzo Vitelli's first public statement came at noon. It was released through his publicist, and it was exactly what Aisha expected. Dismissive and defensive, calling the accusations unfounded attacks from jealous competitors trying to damage my reputation, and insisting he had always celebrated diversity in his work. He pointed to a single black model who had walked in one of his shows 5 years ago as evidence of his commitment to inclusion. But the internet wasn't buying it. Social media users immediately started digging through his past interviews, finding years of problematic comments about race, body size, and beauty standards. Video clips surfaced of him saying things like, "High fashion is about aspiration," in context that made it clear he meant European beauty standards. Photos from his runway shows over the past decade showed an overwhelming lack of diversity, almost exclusively white models, almost all incredibly thin, almost all conforming to the exact same aesthetic. Brands that carried his designs began distancing themselves from him. Department stores released statements about their commitment to diversity and inclusion, some quietly pulling his designs from their shelves. His scheduled show at Paris Fashion Week, which should have been happening in 3 months, was abruptly canceled. The Fashion Council released a statement saying they were reevaluating their relationships with designers who don't reflect the values of inclusivity and respect. Vitelli's Instagram comments became a battleground, with people posting side-by-side comparisons of his shows versus diverse campaigns from other brands. His follower count began dropping rapidly. And through it all, Aisha's face remained on those billboards, impossible to ignore, impossible to forget. She was everywhere, her image a constant reminder that the old rules were changing, that gatekeepers like Vitelli were losing their power. 2 weeks after the campaign launch, Aisha received an unexpected email. It was from Lorenzo Vitelli's personal assistant, a brief, formal message requesting a private meeting. The assistant wrote that Mr. Vitelli wanted to speak with Aisha personally and understood if she declined, but would appreciate the opportunity if she was willing. Aisha stared at the email for a long time, her emotions complicated. She forwarded it to Gabrielle, who called her immediately. You don't have to do this, Gabrielle said firmly. You owe him nothing. Not your time, not your forgiveness, nothing. If you want to ignore this email and move on with your life, that is completely valid. I know, Aisha replied, thinking about it carefully. But I want to hear what he has to say. I want to look him in the eye and see if he's actually learned anything, or if this is just damage control. They agreed to meet at a neutral location, a quiet cafe in downtown Manhattan that Gabrielle suggested. It was upscale but not pretentious, the kind of place where they could talk without being overheard, but also public enough to feel safe. Gabrielle insisted on coming along, sitting at a nearby table with her laptop open as if working, but really there as backup in case Aisha needed her. When Lorenzo Vitelli walked in, Aisha barely recognized him. He looked different from the confident, arrogant designer who had laughed at her in Milan. He looked tired, older. The silver in his hair seemed more pronounced, or maybe it was just that he seemed diminished somehow, as if some essential energy had been drained out of him. His expensive suit was still immaculate, but he wore it differently now, without the casual swagger he'd had before. He looked, Aisha realized, defeated. He sat down across from her without ordering anything, without even pretending this was a social visit. For a long moment, he just stared at the table, his hands clasped in front of him. Aisha waited, refusing to make this easier for him. I'm not here to ask for your forgiveness, he finally said, his voice quieter than she remembered. I don't deserve it, and I'm not going to insult you by pretending I do. He looked up at her, and she was genuinely shocked to see that his eyes were red, rimmed, like he'd been crying or hadn't slept in days. I'm here because I need you to understand something, and then I'll leave you alone. What I said to you that day in Milan was unforgivable. The way I treated you, the things I said about your skin, about your worth, there's no excuse for it, none. But here's what I've realized over the past 2 weeks, it wasn't unique. It wasn't even unusual for me. That's how I've talked, how I've thought, for my entire career. 30 years in this industry, building my brand, and I did it by excluding people, by enforcing standards that weren't about art or beauty, but about my own narrow, prejudiced view of what deserved to be celebrated. Aisha listened without speaking, her expression neutral. She wasn't going to give him absolution, but she was curious to hear what he would say. I was taught this way, he continued, and Aisha caught the defensiveness in his tone. I came up in an era when fashion was about exclusivity, about creating desire through inaccessibility. My mentors, the people who taught me this business, they all operated the same way. But that's not an excuse, is it? At some point, you have to take responsibility for your own choices, for what you perpetuate, even if you didn't create it. He rubbed his face with both hands, looking exhausted. Watching what happened these past 2 weeks, seeing my career collapse, losing everything I built, contracts canceled, shows dropped, stores refusing to carry my designs. I'd like to say it taught me a profound lesson, that I'm a changed man now, that I've seen the error of my ways and I'm going to do better. But the truth is, I don't know if I can change. I don't know if someone who's spent 30 years thinking the way I think can suddenly see the world differently. I don't know if I deserve the chance to try. He pulled out his phone and showed her something. It was a photo of the Times Square billboard, clearly taken from street level looking up. The image was stunning. Aisha's face glowing against the sky, the tagline visible even in the photo. I walk past this every day for a week, he said, his voice shaking slightly. Looking up at your face. Reading that tagline, they said she wasn't beautiful enough. We said she's perfect. And every single time, all I could think was how spectacularly, catastrophically wrong I was. Not just about you. About everything I've built my career on. About what I thought mattered in fashion, in beauty, in art. He put the phone away and looked at her directly. You are breathtakingly beautiful. You're exactly what high fashion should be. Striking, memorable, someone who makes people stop and stare. And I was so blinded by my own prejudices, so trapped in my narrow definition of beauty, that I couldn't see it. I laughed at you. I tried to humiliate you. And it took losing everything for me to be able to admit how wrong I was. He stood up, preparing to leave. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm not asking for a second chance. I'm not even sure what I'm asking for, honestly. I just needed you to know that you were right to accept Gabrielle's offer. You were right to let her send that email. You were right to tell your story. And I hope that every young model who looks like you sees your face on those billboards and knows that people like me don't get to define beauty anymore. That gate is closing, and I'm on the wrong side of it. He turned to leave, then paused, seeming to struggle with something. For what it's worth, and I know it's worth very little at this point, you're one of the most beautiful women I've ever seen in 30 years of working in fashion. It took losing everything, my reputation, my business, my credibility, for me to be able to admit that honestly. I'm sorry it came too late to matter. He walked out of the cafe, and Aisha watched him go through the window. She saw him pause on the sidewalk, looking lost for a moment, before he turned and walked away, his shoulders hunched against the autumn wind. She didn't feel satisfaction, exactly, though there was a small part of her that felt vindicated. She didn't feel pity for him either, even though he clearly wanted her to. She just felt tired, and strangely empty, and ready to move forward. His apology, such as it was, didn't change what had happened. It didn't erase the humiliation she'd felt that day in Milan, or the years of rejection that had come before it. But it did confirm something she'd needed to know, that she had been right all along. And he had been wrong. Gabrielle came over to her table and sat down, studying her face with concern. How do you feel? I feel like I don't need his apology. Aisha said slowly, working through her thoughts as she spoke. I never did. What I needed was the chance to prove him wrong. And I got that. What I needed was for the world to see what he tried to deny. That I am beautiful, that I do belong in high fashion, that his narrow definition of beauty was always bullshit, and now millions of people have seen that. You did more than prove him wrong, Gabrielle said, and there was something fierce and proud in her voice. You changed the entire conversation. Do you know how many modeling agencies have called me in the past 2 weeks, asking about models with your look? How many brands are scrambling to diversify their campaigns because they saw what we did and realized they've been leaving money on the table by ignoring women of color? How many young black girls have written to our customer service saying they finally feel beautiful because they saw someone who looks like them in a luxury campaign? She pulled out her tablet and showed Aisha some of the emails that had been flooding in. Read these. This is what you did. Aisha scrolled through the emails, her eyes filling with tears. There were messages from teenagers saying they'd never seen anyone who looked like them in high fashion before. That seeing Aisha's face made them believe they could be beautiful too. Messages from mothers thanking Luminance for creating products that actually worked for their daughters' skin tones. Messages from women in their 40s and 50s saying they'd never bought luxury makeup before because they assumed it wasn't made for them, but now they were trying Luminance Noir and feeling seen for the first time. The response was overwhelming, touching, humbling. This is bigger than revenge, Gabrielle said softly. This is about changing systems, about shifting what's possible. You didn't just get back at one cruel designer. You showed the entire industry that there's a massive market they've been ignoring, that diversity isn't just morally right. It's profitable. And trust me, fashion listens when money talks. Over the next few weeks, Aisha watched as the fashion industry scrambled to catch up with what Luminance Noir had started. Other beauty brands rushed to expand their shade ranges, suddenly discovering that yes, women of color did buy luxury makeup when it was actually made for them. Fashion magazines that had featured mostly white models for decades suddenly had cover issues celebrating diversity. Designers who had ignored models of color for years were now casting them in runway shows, though Aisha suspected some of this was performative rather than genuine change. But even performative change was better than nothing because it meant the conversation had shifted. The baseline expectations had changed. 6 months later, when Aisha's contract with Luminance came up for renewal, Gabrielle offered her not just an extension, but an expansion. Another year, with an increased salary of $500,000, plus those same royalties and something new, creative control over future campaigns, and the opportunity to be involved in product development. Luminance Noir had exceeded every sales projection, becoming one of the most successful product launches in the company's history. The line had expanded to include skincare, with Aisha consulting on what products women with deeper skin tones actually needed and wanted. But Aisha's influence extended far beyond Luminance. She appeared on the cover of 3 major fashion magazines, Vogue, Elle, and Harper's Bazaar, all within the span of 4 months. Each cover story was about more than just beauty. They explored representation in fashion, the economics of exclusion, the way the industry had historically gatekept, and who was finally breaking through those gates. She walked in shows for designers who had previously ignored models with her look, including a stunning appearance at Paris Fashion Week that had the audience on their feet. And every single time someone interviewed her, she told the truth about what Lorenzo Vitelli had said to her that day in Milan. She didn't tell the story to be cruel or to continue punishing him. She told it because she wanted other young models to know they weren't alone, that the cruelty they experienced wasn't their fault, that beauty standards were constructed and could be deconstructed. She told it because every time she shared her experience, other women reached out with their own stories, and that collective testimony was powerful, undeniable. She told it because silence had protected people like Vitelli for too long, and speaking truth was the only way to create real change. Lorenzo Vitelli never recovered professionally. His brand collapsed completely within 6 months, unable to secure funding or partnerships after the scandal. The business was eventually bought out by a larger corporation for a fraction of what it had once been worth, and they immediately rebranded, bringing in a diverse creative team that included several Black designers and casting directors. Some people said the backlash against Vitelli had been too harsh, that cancel culture had gone too far, that everyone deserved a second chance. But most people understood that this wasn't about one comment or one bad day or one incident of cruelty. It was about decades of systemic discrimination, and Vitelli had simply been the face of it when it finally came crashing down. He'd had chances, countless chances, to do better, to treat people with basic human dignity, to use his power for good rather than exclusion. He'd chosen not to take those chances, and now he was facing the consequences. Aisha heard through industry connections that Vitelli had left New York, moved somewhere in Europe, Portugal, someone said, or maybe southern Spain. He'd effectively retired from fashion, giving a few interviews where he portrayed himself as a victim of political correctness, though those interviews were largely ignored. Fashion had moved on without him, and the industry had discovered that it was better off for his absence. As for Aisha, she continued modeling, becoming one of the most sought-after faces in both commercial and high fashion. But she also started speaking at universities and industry events about representation and beauty standards, about the economics of inclusion, about why diversity couldn't just be a trend, but needed to be fundamental to how fashion operated. She used her platform strategically and deliberately to lift up other models who looked like her, who had been told they weren't enough. When casting directors called her for jobs, she sometimes suggested other Black models she knew who deserved opportunities. When brands approached her for collaborations, she used her negotiating power to insist on diverse creative teams. She started a mentorship program through her agency, working with young models of color to help them navigate an industry that still had a long way to go. She taught them how to handle rejection, how to advocate for themselves, how to recognize when someone was trying to diminish them, and how to walk away with their dignity intact. She told them about that day in Milan, about sitting on those steps crying, about how close she'd come to giving up entirely. And she told them about the week that changed everything, about how one person with power and compassion could open doors that had been locked for decades. Every time she spoke, whether to a room full of fashion students or a boardroom full of executives, she started with the same story, about a designer who laughed at her and told her she wasn't beautiful enough for high fashion, about a woman named Gabrielle Ross who heard that cruelty and decided to do something about it, about a billboard in Times Square that became a symbol of change, and about the simple, revolutionary idea that beauty had never had limits. It had only had gatekeepers, and those gates were finally breaking down. The fashion industry still had problems. Aisha was realistic enough to know that one campaign, one story, one model couldn't fix decades of systemic racism and exclusion. There were still designers who preferred a narrow definition of beauty, still casting directors who overlooked women of color, still magazines that put diversity on the cover, but not throughout their pages. But something had shifted. The conversation had changed. The baseline expectations were different now. Brands knew they would be called out for lack of diversity. Models of color had more leverage, more options, more platforms to speak their truth. And every time Aisha walked past a Luminance Noir display in a department store, or saw one of the campaign images that was still in circulation 2 years later, or heard from a young Black girl who said seeing her face had changed how she saw herself, she felt that fierce, hot feeling in her chest again, not revenge, not even satisfaction, something deeper and more lasting. The knowledge that she had taken the worst moment of her career and transformed it into something meaningful, something that mattered beyond her own success. This is what happens when cruelty meets consequence, when someone with power decides to use it for justice instead of gatekeeping. Lorenzo Vitelli thought he could laugh at Aisha Thompson and face no repercussions because that's how the fashion industry had always worked. The powerful could say whatever they wanted, treat people however they pleased, and there were never any real consequences. But Gabrielle Ross proved that the old rules could be rewritten. She proved that witness matters, that speaking up matters, that using your platform and resources for good can create ripple effects far beyond what you imagine. And Aisha proved that the face of beauty could look like anyone, if only someone would give her the chance to shine. She proved that talent and determination could overcome even the most entrenched prejudices. She proved that the girl sitting on the steps crying after being humiliated could become the face on a 50-foot billboard if she just refused to let cruelty define her worth. The Luminance Noir campaign ran for 3 years, constantly refreshed with new images and new products, but always featuring Aisha. It became one of the most successful and influential beauty campaigns in recent history, studied in marketing classes and fashion programs as an example of how representation could drive both cultural change and commercial success. The products themselves were genuinely good. Aisha wouldn't have continued working with Luminance if they weren't. And they filled a real gap in the market that other brands scrambled to copy. But more than the products or the sales figures or the awards the campaign won, what mattered was the doors it opened. In the 3 years after Luminance Noir launched, the number of black models booked for luxury campaigns increased significantly. It wasn't enough. There was still a long way to go. But it was measurable change. Major agencies started actively recruiting models of color instead of treating diversity as an afterthought. Fashion weeks in New York, Paris, London, and Milan saw more diverse runways. Beauty brands expanded their shade ranges not as a special collection, but as a baseline expectation. None of this would have happened from the campaign alone, of course. There were activists and advocates who had been fighting for representation for decades, other models who had spoken out about discrimination, journalists who had been documenting these issues long before Aisha's story went viral. But the Luminance Noir campaign became a touchstone, a before and after moment that people could point to and say this is when something shifted. This is when the industry couldn't ignore these issues anymore. Aisha never forgot where she came from. Even as her career took off and her bank account grew and doors that had been closed her entire life suddenly opened, she remembered sitting on those steps in Milan, feeling smaller than she'd ever felt. She remembered every rejection, every time someone had looked at her and decided she wasn't quite right, wasn't quite enough. She remembered the casual cruelty of Lorenzo Vitelli's laugh, the way he dismissed her humanity so easily. But she also remembered Gabrielle sitting down beside her, offering not pity but opportunity. She remembered the feeling of signing that contract, of seeing her face on that billboard for the first time, of watching the fashion industry scramble to adapt to a standard of beauty that had always existed but had never been properly celebrated. And she carried all of those memories, the painful ones and the triumphant ones, as she moved forward, using them as fuel to keep pushing for change. Years later, when she was established enough in her career to be selective about her projects, Aisha started her own production company focused on creating content that celebrated diverse beauty. She produced documentaries about the history of black models in fashion, the economics of exclusion, the way beauty standards had been weaponized across different cultures and eras. She created a YouTube channel where she interviewed other models about their experiences, giving them space to tell stories that the mainstream fashion press often ignored. And she never stopped telling her own story about Lorenzo Vitelli, about Gabrielle Ross, about the week that changed everything. Not because she was stuck in the past, but because she knew that her story wasn't unique. For every model who got the opportunity she got, there were dozens more who were still being told they weren't beautiful enough, weren't the right look, didn't fit the brand's vision. And those models needed to know that the people rejecting them were wrong, that beauty had never had the limits that gatekeepers tried to impose on it. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been told you weren't good enough because of how you looked, because of your skin color or your body type or any other aspect of your appearance that you couldn't and shouldn't have to change, then know that you're not alone. Know that the standards that excluded you were never about you. They were about systems of power and control that served a narrow group of people for far too long. Know that those standards are being challenged and changed, slowly but surely, by people who refuse to accept that beauty has limits. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Talk about your own experiences with discrimination and exclusion, because the more we speak these truths, the harder it becomes for people like Lorenzo Vitelli to keep operating with impunity. Support brands and designers and magazines that are actually doing the work of representation, not just performing it for good publicity. And if you're in a position of power, if you're the person doing the hiring or the casting or the selecting, remember Gabrielle Ross, who heard cruelty and decided to do something about it, who used her power to open doors instead of keeping them closed. Beauty has no limits. It never did. It just took one billboard, one campaign, one fearless woman, and one person with power who decided to use it for good to remind the world of that truth. And once that reminder was out there, visible on 50-foot billboards in every major city, it became impossible to ignore. The old gatekeepers could protest all they wanted, could insist that standards were standards and business was business, but the proof was right there, undeniable, and stunning and successful Aisha Thompson's face, representing a beauty that had always existed, but had finally been given the platform it deserved. This is the story of how one moment of cruelty became a catalyst for change, how one woman's determination, combined with another woman's power and compassion, created ripples that spread across an entire industry, how a designer's worst moment became a model's greatest opportunity, and how the face that was laughed out of a casting room in Milan became the face that launched a movement, proving once and for all that the people who tried to limit what beauty could look like were not just wrong. They were obsolete. Where are you watching from? What's your story of being underestimated or dismissed or told you didn't belong? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this story belongs to everyone who's ever been on the wrong side of a closed door, everyone who's ever been told they weren't enough. This is for you. This is your reminder that the people who tried to limit you were wrong, and that somewhere out there, your opportunity is waiting. You just have to keep showing up, keep believing in your worth, and keep pushing forward until someone with power sees what you've known all along, that you belong, that you're enough, that you're exactly what the world needs to see.